Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm well, thanks, and enjoying the weather, and I hope you're enjoying it too.
Thank you.
It seems to me that as globalization progresses, everything that relates to the way society works is changing faster and faster. And what I think we have to focus on is the fact that it seems to change. The rate of change seems to accelerate, and the type of change is basically the same, but it's very difficult to see what it's going to change into in the long run. So if we start at the way society really, obviously social change starts with population growth, and population growth has been accelerating from as far back as we have any knowledge of at all. And it's amazing that how fast the population has grown over the last century, so that from 2 billion global population in the 1930s, we're up to almost 8 billion now, even though demographers tell us that we're slowing down, thank goodness, at the moment. Anyway, to focus on the way this acceleration has worked. It began with the development of long-distance trade, after we became a fully global species, maybe 7,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then that trade was intensified or increased by the adoption of literacy for recording contracts and transactions, right, in the just 5,000 years ago, and then literacy, the way literacy was used, kept expanding and becoming more productive, so that people could interact over much larger distances. And it wasn't just moving between one place and another, but actually, well, because people had to move in order to move the letters, but there were people interacting by mail over large distances in some parts of the world. And nothing much else happened until the 19th century. But it's been accelerating very noticeably since then. And in the first half of the last century, when I was growing up, wireless and telephone were new.
Right.
It wasn't until the 1970s that it was routine to telephone long distance.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, made an enormous difference. But I remember that I sent my first email in 1986.
Yes.
From one building in the campus of the University of Pennsylvania to another through the telephone lines, which I thought was clever at the time.
Oh, yeah. It was a miracle. I remember those things. Yeah. Yeah.
But I've been playing with computers since they began, since I came in contact with them in the 1970s. Anyway, since then, email has become such an important part of communication for the whole world. Anything. Email is often the first point of contact, and has been very useful. And I have been depending almost entirely on email since it became more general in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
But in this past week, I've been thinking of maybe giving it up.
Now, why is that?
Because I get too much.
Okay.
And I spend far too much of every day catching up with my email. and I can't keep up with it. And not only that, but the mail I get from the U.S. Postal Service, I open everything I get just to see what it is, but almost all of it I just put straight in the recycling bin.
Correct. Me too. Yeah.
And this sort of thing is getting worse and worse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we've in the last few decades, the rate of change, that is the rate of intensification of social interaction among larger and larger numbers of people, has accelerated to the point where it's becoming unproductive, whereas before it had been very productive. Now,
hold on a second. I can remember bits done by Johnny Carson in the Tonight Show in the 1970s, talking about the proliferation of junk mail, and the whole audience would sigh knowingly. I mean, it was clearly a national problem. Everybody experienced too much mail coming in the postal service.
Really? I don't remember that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So it could be argued that what we're seeing now, I mean, probably 60%, 70% of the emails I receive are junk emails.
Yeah.
You know, I just spend some time every day going through the emails, deleting things. So it could be argued that we're at the same place that we were 50 years ago. It's just a different medium.
Yeah. So the big question is, what happens next? Because the amount of interaction has increased to the point where it's no longer productive; it's unproductive, and it's become almost impossible to make sure you only get the email that is useful.
Yeah, you can't close all the gates off.
People find your email address and send you things, whether you want it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure exactly when that began, but it's been becoming a more and more difficult problem for some time now. So does that mean people are going to start treating email in the same way that they treat junk mail, and there's going to be another new form of interaction, or is something else going to happen? But we're probably heading for a new sort of social change, and whether that will be productive and make it possible for people to choose their interaction and select interactions in a more productive way or not, difficult to tell. I mean, generally in the past, in human history, looking back, it seems as though we've generally managed to select the most productive form of change. We're amazingly adaptive and able to come together in new ways in larger and larger numbers more productively. But I wonder whether that's actually going to continue in the long term.
Or when you talk about the continuance in the long term, are you referencing at all some of the events politically of late?
Well, we were so proud of the development of democracy, and the way our ability to interact with each other politically changed in a very productive way, beginning in the 17th century, I suppose.
Right, with the Dutch.
And it has worked very well, and we managed to divorce religion from politics, church from state, and that seems to have worked. But then we reorganized the world in terms of what came to be called nation states, even though they're not nations that became states, they're states that were told they were nations.
Mm-hmm.
So the word nation is very, I think, deceptive these days. But now we've got problems like Brexit and the fact that it may be the end of the United Kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah.
But democracy is not working as well now as it has been for the last couple of centuries. So that we have, partly because politics is a much more of a career and a specialty, something that you need experience in order to practice it usefully.
Mm-hmm.
And we're getting more and more people in the top jobs who have no experience at all and don't know what they're doing, even in the largest countries.
Well, I find it ironic that the two countries we often talk about that are not democracies, China and Russia, are just this weekend sort of gloating a little bit. The Chinese very smugly are making anonymous comments to the New York Times and the Washington Post as to how they've successfully maneuvered the Trump administration into negotiating with itself to achieve this recently announced trade agreement. And then the Russians, of course, who are over the moon because of the influence that they've managed to exert over the American political process. And I can understand the rejoicing that might be going on at the professional levels of the tops of both of those governments, the Chinese and the Russians. But below that, with the average citizen in both of those countries and the average citizen in this country, is there any change? I mean,
well, the Russians pretend to be democratic.
Right.
They have elections. The Chinese are more concerned about cultural unity than anything else, and trying to make sure that Hong Kong doesn't disrupt their cultural unity. It's interesting that different cultural histories produce different attitudes towards political unity. But even the countries which are the originators of democracy, England and America, are having great difficulty.
Great difficulty.
And it's not clear at all we've got next year is going to be very interesting because of the effort the Democratic Party is going to have to make in order to come down from 20 potential candidates to just one, which is done generally in a not a terribly democratic way anyway.
Right. And you still remain optimistic about the future.
Well, I'm a congenital optimist, I'm afraid, but I'm always ready for it to be what I expect in the long run to be delayed, even though I don't have much time to wait anymore.
Well, I don't think anybody does anymore. We were talking before the broadcast about globalization continuing, of course, but it may be taking a different path at the moment.
Yeah.
So I think that looks to be what's going to happen. I don't know if we're heading into a dead end railroad siding or if it's going to be another path toward increased nationalism, specific countries' interests first, and a delaying of pan-Europeanism or pan-Americanism or whatever it might be.
Well, it's very interesting what's happening to the European Union. There's a lot of protests. Apart from the Brexit problem, there's a lot of protests going on in Italy as well now.
Yeah,
and I don't quite understand what the cause of those protests is. But anyway, bringing things together in a democratic way seems to be very difficult.
Well,
but now we can take a break for Christmas.
Maybe everybody will be in a more charitable mood during the Christmas season, and things will come together more easily. Who knows? So, all right. Well, Professor Spooner, we'll stop there for now. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Spooner, how are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
This morning, I think you know that some time ago now, in an introductory essay to a volume on globalization, I wrote that globalization was on the cards from the start, because I thought that the fact that population growth had led us to spread throughout the world, and we had language, meant that sooner or later we were all going to be in contact with each other. But what's always puzzled me is why, in fact, do people always collect together in the largest possible numbers? And that's happened throughout human history. And until about 10,000 years ago, the numbers were always very small because of the availability of food, and we were not yet producing our own food. Mm-hmm. But since food has not become a problem, we keep collecting together in larger and larger numbers, and now we're going to become a totally urbanized world in what remains of this century, as far as I can see. Anyway, somebody I met in an elevator a few years ago, and got talking to about the axial age and big history, and then we became quite close friends and have been talking to each other ever since. Had an interesting new idea this week, which he told me about, which I think helps us to understand a lot of things. And that is that when we left our primate cousins up in the trees in South Central Africa and came down onto the plains and wandered out away from the trees on the plains, we were vulnerable to predators. Yes. In a way that we had never been before. And it was then that we started collecting together in larger and larger numbers in order for security. And that tendency seems to have been part of our evolution, because after all, we had not evolved entirely into the creatures we became in the following millennia. That was hundreds of thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I think that explains it. However, the problem, of course, that we have now is that we have to organize ourselves, and it's our organization of ourselves which is leading to all the problems. So this evolutionary proclivity that appears to have been launched a few 100,000 years ago is still driving us to collect together in larger and larger numbers. And now there are really no restrictions on that process. Mm-hmm. But because as the numbers get larger, the organizational problems get bigger. All the problems we're having in globalization have to do with different forms of organization. And of course, when the literacy helped us to develop much larger forms of political organization and economic organization, for that matter. And then the age of empires started with literate administrations some 4,000 years ago, and lasted really until the middle of the last century, when we finally got rid of the European empires. But the empires really did bring things closer together. Mm-hmm. But the problem with the empires was that they divided the world up into administrative districts, And when they when they disintegrated and ceased to be empires in the middle of the last century, or in the first since 1900, their administrative districts became what we have come to call nation states, because of the problems of the relation of the interrelation of spiritual and political authority, which we've solved in some ways for some periods, as with the Pope and the archbishops and so on in the Catholic Church, but not on a permanent basis, as we can see with the Reformation 500 years ago. Anyway, so now we have this problem of conflict between, well, since the end of the Age of Empires, we've had a sort of fake empire run by America as the world hegemon, and that has added to the problems of the formation of nation states, because the whole point of the formation of nation states was that each state would be independent in terms of religion as well as political organization, and it would and no state would have the right to tell neighboring states what the correct interpretation of the Bible was. But the problem with American hegemony has been that not only has it been influencing the development of nation states since the end of the empires, but it's also been exerting cultural influence in other ways. And so now we have this terrible problem between, well, with Iran, for example, in the Middle East. And last Friday, when we were unable to meet, I spent the day in Washington at a board meeting of an organization that is a consortium of American universities, and I was representing the University of Pennsylvania, working out how to solve some of the current problems of the American Institute of Iranian Studies, which is an organization that began in the late 60s that I've been involved in ever since. And of course, since the Iranian Revolution has not been able to function in the way that it was functioning before. And this has meant that whereas we had a way of training Iranists, people specializing in Iranian studies, which is quite a well-developed historical field of academic study, but since then, since the late 70s, we've not been able to train anybody in this field. And now all the people who were trained in that field and were heading programs in half a dozen universities in America, apart from other universities in Europe,
they're all retiring.
Are retiring, and there's nobody to replace them. So this means that whereas up until 50 years ago, we knew a lot about the world, that is in the universities, although people in the State Department tended not to know very much about the rest of the world. Now, in the age of globalization, because of what we've been doing in other ways, we're not training scholars and scientists with experience in the world as a whole.
Right. Let me jump in a little bit. You've thrown a lot at me from that one elevator ride, and thankfully you indicated that you had developed a close friendship with this person, and it was not all in one elevator ride. I fully understand the fact that Neanderthals who descended from the trees and were able to make it out to the plains, especially those who could hold their young under one arm to get out to the watering hole, and thus were forced to stand up straighter because they were carrying their young, and then do that and get back into the safety of the woods, and then come back the next day with another mother with another young child, and then groups of them eventually, in order to just protect themselves in the event of predators, so more would be able to return to the safety of the trees. And going on to where we are today, I mean, this is a blink of an eye in history, right? This is what, 30 or 40 or 50,000 years or so. So where this is going to go, I think where that group of Neanderthal mothers with their babies at a watering hole out in the middle of a plain in South Central Africa, 5 or 6 of them, 50,000 years ago, to where we are now with 22 million people living in Mexico City, or 1.5 billion people connected on Facebook, to have happened in 50,000 years is pretty remarkable. And then I superimposed that fact on the President of the United States making the speech on Wednesday in front of the United Nations, in which he said globalization is dead. It's no longer operable. It's been replaced by national patriotism. And I just don't get it. I don't understand it. Is it a complete? I mean, the speech had to have been written. It clearly was not written by the president. The way he delivered it was clear. He had not read it before. It's official policy of the United States government. I mean, how is it that people are not understanding what's happening, where even the most ill-informed president of this country can stand there and make that kind of remark? I don't understand where the disconnect is. What do you think?
There's so much competition between political units of different sizes. So the large ones compete with each other globally, and now there's competition, obviously, between developing competition between America, Europe, European Union, and China, and India, actually. And locally, but among smaller units, so between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which their relationship's been in the news this past week because they can't agree on their border, which again was drawn by the British in 1893. And Africa is just a patchwork of these problems. So I'm afraid, in my mind, of course, I have to be careful what I say so that I don't appear to be chauvinist, but I think that America is causing more problems like this than any of the other large countries at the moment, although that may change as the others gradually become more powerful. Because, to a large extent, the reason is that the people in charge of policy in this country are not academically trained to understand what's going on in other parts of the world. And 50 years ago, I don't think people in America were that well trained either, partly because they are, whereas in Europe, every country is very close to every other country, and then many of them had empires which took them to all over the world. America didn't have an empire, at least not in that sense, and had 2 large ponds, one on either side, which separated it from what was going on in other parts of the world. And now we're told that only 30% of Americans, even now in the 21st century, have passports.
Right. So
it's really is an anomaly that the economically most powerful country in the world is a center of the least knowledge about what's going on in the rest of the world.
So in a funny way, when we several years ago would talk about nations or states, we would talk about states that were actively trying to thwart the forces of globalization. All right, and we would talk about countries such as North Korea. We would talk a little bit about Iran, I think, even. Where we are now, after several years of discussion, the United States has now entered that category.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Well, you know, I mean, it's such a paradox, really, that the Middle East is most of the boundaries in the Middle East were drawn by Europeans and then reinforced by Americans. And American policy since the middle of the last century has been not to export democracy, but to reinforce political stability as Americans understood it, which was not democracy, because democracy was unpredictable, partly because it wanted to nationalize local oil companies, which were American owned.
Right.
And Britain had something to do with this as well. I'm not.
Anglo-American oil.
Yeah.
Well, very interesting. So what do you think when you get back to your view of the progressive nature of globalization, going back to that blink of an eye to our cousins or descendants or ancestors, I should say, coming out of the trees into the plains? Where are we going here?
Well, I think that I mean what that explains is why coming together has been a more important part of the historical process than conflict. And now there's probably more conflict now than there has been, or more serious conflict now than there has been in the past, because of these problems of organization. But I think it's going to change again as the differences in economic and political power between America, the European Union, and the other large political units, especially China and India, they become more closely related to each other and have to reach some sort of agreement, because at the moment there's no effort at all to reach agreement on a global level. The United Nations was, in a way, developed with that purpose, but has been not been successful.
Well, I think we should probably leave it at there, Professor Spooner. Very interesting. I'm going to keep that in mind as I try to interpret the events of this week and the week coming up. So,
We'll watch what happens.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.